It's time for Joan Esposito. Live, local, and progressive.
I want somebody who's passionate. I want somebody who can talk to people like a real person, who can make people feel things, who can make people want to follow them.
It's time for Joan Esposito on WCPT 820, Chicago's Progressive Talk.
And it is time for the unofficial, official WCPT book club. I gave you a heads up this morning that it was going to be time for Chapter 7 of The Liberal Backbone. This is Spencer Critchley, author of Patriots of Two Nations' new book. And he is, instead of waiting to spend a year getting it printed and published, he is putting it up on dastardlycleverness.com. chapter by chapter, so that we can read it and we can discuss it. And Spencer, before we get started, how are you doing today?
Well, I'm just trying to slow down the spinning of my head. Is the main effort. I mean, apparently now we're explicitly on the side of German Nazis and Russian fascists against Ukraine and Europe.
Yes.
And then meanwhile, Republican Senator John Kennedy, not to be confused with the good John Kennedy,
yeah.
who I disagree with about everything. I actually agreed with what he was saying during the newscast just now, that he actually thinks that Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine, that Ukraine didn't start the war by being invaded.
Well,
and,
even I was reading this in the previous hour. Mike Pence, the former vice president, Mike Pence posted on social media today, "No, Mr. President, Ukraine did not start this war. They were invaded by Russia." So even Mike Pence has felt that it was necessary to stick his head up out of the sand, which he does only very rarely these days. Yeah. But this was one of the statements that somehow, Vladimir Putin was sort of an innocent victim in all this. He's gaslighting us. Somebody on the internet posted a graphic that they said he said spotted on the European side of the internet. And the graphic is how it feels to be European right now. And it shows a little guy with a blue lightsaber with the European Union flag over his head, and a Darth Vader-like guy with a red lightsaber with Hungary's flag, Soviet Union or Russia's flag, and the United States flag over his head. God. We do seem to be one of the bad guys now. We do seem
We're on
to
the
be
side of Darth Vader.
Yes, if Trump and Elon Musk are in cahoots with Vladimir Putin, and that's what we're getting. Yeah,
I mean, as your savvy listeners probably already know, but just in case, our vice president, although it's not really sure what his job is anymore, went to Europe and basically told our European allies to go F themselves and lectured them for not being fair to AfD, Alternative for Deutschland, the heirs to the Nazi Party, these Holocaust-denying neo-Nazis. And he met with the leadership of AfD, as Musk has done online on X, hosting a special event with the leader of the AfD, and Vance refused to meet with Olaf Scholz, the actual head of Germany. So literally, we are on the side of Nazis under this administration, and we're on the side of Vladimir Putin, who, let's remember, is explicitly a fascist. His favorite philosopher is a Russian fascist from the 20th century named Ivan Ilyin. You can look it up. He's become essentially the official philosopher of Russia under Vladimir Putin.
He's somebody who's still alive? Because I'm not familiar with him at all.
I think he died some time ago, but he was alive for much of the 20th century. And he's an explicit fascist, an admirer of Adolf Hitler. And Putin, for all he loves to call Ukrainians fascism, this, of course, is like the Alice in Wonderland logic that's always operating. with totalitarians like Putin. But as much as he accuses the Ukrainians of being fascists and Nazis, Putin is an open admirer of Ivan Ilyin. He instructs the leadership of Russia to read Ilyin and his theories of the fascist destiny of Mother Russia. And so these are the people we're on board with. These are our allies now. Has any American grown up watching World War II movies and rooted for the Nazis in those movies? I mean, there are some, but those people are called Nazis. Mm-hmm. And now we are on the side of Nazis. There's no way around it. Putin is a Nazi admiring fascist, and the AfD is a Nazi party that denies the Holocaust, et cetera. And Putin, meanwhile, deliberately targets apartment buildings and hospitals and railway stations and kidnap hundreds of Ukrainian children. Imagine that. Kidnapping children from their parents to take them to Russia and give them to new parents who then indoctrinate them in Russian propaganda. And meanwhile, speaking of propaganda, our president gives a press conference in which he parrots Russian propaganda word for word. Unbelievable, just unbelievable. It's one of those things where you can't. The one reason why it's not hitting people the way it should, I think, especially people in the media, is that it's so astounding. Your mind just can't believe it's actually happening. So you just kind of move on and pretend life is still normal.
I've been thinking about why. I always try to figure out why someone did what they did. Why would J.D. Vance meet with the Nazis in Germany and basically snub the rest of leadership in Germany and the European Union? And the only thing that makes sense to me, because I don't believe that he did it at Donald Trump's behest, because I don't think Donald Trump is educated enough or smart enough to understand what party is what and who's who. I think the only thing that makes sense to me is that he did it to ingratiate himself with Elon Musk, so that if there ever comes a time when he needs to step in and take the reins of power, he's already got J.D. Vance already has Elon Musk's support. What do you think? What else? Why else would he do it?
I think that's brilliant. But here's my twist on it. I think what he's saying is, I am ready to be Elon Musk's vice president.
Oh. Well, Elon Musk, though, at least if we're going to follow the Constitution, and who knows, it's an old document, he can't become president.
Oh, please.
Yeah.
The Constitution is for weaklings.
I'm beginning to think so.
In this ideology, I mean, that's pretty close to the truth. This is the ideology of will that does come down to us from the Nazis and before them from Friedrich Nietzsche. And, this whole philosophical tradition of will. Carl Schmitt, one of the leading Nazi philosophers who was a lawyer and a legal theorist who justified Nazism, even after World War II, he was still justifying it. And Carl Schmitt is an influence on many of the people advising Trump now. And this is explicitly a philosophy based on will, not reason. And so reason produces the Constitution and laws and the rule of law, liberal democracy. But that's for weaklings. I mean, literally, this is the way this is looked at. That's for, pencil-pushing bureaucrats and weaklings who just get in the way of the true heroes who should be running society. And this also lines up with Musk's thinking. And there's there's a bunch of people in Silicon Valley who have adopted this kind of thinking as well. But also, I said Friedrich Nietzsche is a source, but more approximately it's Ayn Rand, who I refer to as Nietzsche for dummies. And so they've read The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged, and that's their philosophy of life. And that they, of course, are the heroes in Atlas Shrugged. So yeah, I mean, they do have contempt for the Constitution. Laws are there to protect weak people, and weak people they're the Untermenschen, use the law and use morality, including Christian morality, to enslave the Übermenschen. And so that these people essentially see themselves as the Übermenschen who are throwing off these chains and realizing their glorious destiny, which will be all to the good for all the little people as well.
I do want to get to the book, but I have one more a thought that I want to talk with you about this, and we need to take a real quick break. When I come back with Spencer Critchley, though, the Republicans who are in Congress and in the Senate have been very quiet and been basically rolling over for outrageously incompetent cabinet picks. And, now Mike Johnson is going to do that one magic budget bill that Trump has been whining about. I know that they're faced with Trump's revenge and Elon Musk's money, so they've been pretty quiet and pretty cooperative so far. But if indeed, all these cuts start really resonating with people and people get really mad, we have midterm elections coming up in about 600 some days. And remember, congressional elections happen every 2 years, and they're barely holding on to a majority now. And I'm wondering if self-preservation might trump their cowardliness and actually get some of these Republicans to start opposing this shadow president, Elon Musk, and even some of the stuff Trump wants to do. Spencer Critchley and I will tackle that when we come right back after this.
Now back to Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive on WCPT 820.
Before we went to break, I asked Spencer Critchley, author of Patriots of Two Nations, also host of the podcast Dastardly Cleverness in the Service of Good. I asked him to think about whether or not Republicans might oppose Elon Musk or President Trump if they felt that their very jobs were on the line in the midterm elections. Spencer, what do you think?
Yeah, I think so, because finally that gets to what is holding the place of a moral core that would otherwise be there, and that's just pure craven self-interest. So just as we saw, there's a great piece in the New York Times from a couple of days ago about Tom Taft in North Carolina and how he was holding out against the nomination of Pete Hegseth to be Secretary of Defense. But they put pressure on him, and the Times had excellent sources, apparently inside meetings, and he had been organizing resistance against Hegseth, which Tom Tillis. Did I say Tom Taft?
Yeah.
Tom.
Oh, probably
sorry, Tom
a friend
Tillis.
of yours.
Sorry, apologies to Tom Taft. Anyway, so he buckled, and he had been organizing resistance to Hegseth on principled grounds, but he buckled, because he was worried.
As did Joni Ernst, who could have killed Hegseth's nomination in committee.
Yeah, but you know
and
what?
Supposedly she was threatened as well.
Yeah, the worst thing that could possibly happen is I don't get elected. And this is how, among all the things that could kill us, careerism could kill us, because so many Americans have elevated their career to the status of just that which must never be endangered. The career takes on sacred value, but, there was a time when honor had sacred value, and you would sacrifice. It's not even a career, it's just a job, and in Congress, not even a particularly good job, really. I mean, it's great when good people are in that position and doing good things, but the job itself is a grind. Anyway, so yeah, if these people are worried that they're going to lose re-election, then they'll suddenly develop a conscience for sure. And I think we're already seeing signs of these artificial consciences sprouting up. We're in Kansas, for example, where that they stand to lose, $2 billion or something with the elimination of USAID?
Yeah, pretty much most of the farmers in Kansas are facing bankruptcy because the farmers in Kansas used USAID as their major market. USAID bought their crops and shipped them over to countries where people were starving. And I was reading where Republicans in that state, because they still don't want to go up against Trump, they are trying to get those specific programs that bought Kansas farmers' crops, and they're trying to get them taken out of USAID and put into the agriculture department because they think they can save them that way. And Kansas, that way they don't have to say, don't do this is a bad idea to Elon and Trump, and yet they can still save their farmers.
Yeah, this is just utter moral rot. This is how you corrupt an entire nation. Because it's okay as long as I save my people, but the rest of America can go to hell. In California, where, as you know, I am, Trump, as I know you would have heard, but it hasn't gotten much news coverage, ordered the release of just gazillions of gallons of precious water from a reservoir.
Yeah, we did. We talked about that a couple of weeks ago. Yeah, and his argument is if only you people in California had done that sooner, you could have put out the fires in L.A., not understanding the geography. Explain the geography, right. Spencer.
The water does not get to L.A. L.A. is fed by an entirely different water system. So the water he drained out of that reservoir was being saved to water the farms of his voters in the Central Valley of California. The Central Valley of California is for the most part, except for the farm working population for the most part, is extremely conservative. It's like Nebraska or somewhere. It's like the Midwest, but you're in the middle of California. It's just thousands of square miles of incredibly fertile farmland, and so people are growing crops there, and they can't do it without government-supplied water because there isn't enough rainfall to support it.
Especially in August.
Yeah, so what they do is during the winter, they pray that there's enough snow in the Sierra Nevadas and rain otherwise during the winter, and it all gets stored in these reservoirs. And then it's used during the summer, the spring and summer, to water the crops. So Trump, of course, overwhelmingly wins the votes of these farmers. And then because he's got this boneheaded idea stuck in his mind that the solution to water supply for L.A. to fight fires is simple, and they just didn't figure out that all they had to do was turn on the taps in Northern California, not stopping to check whether that water would actually get there. And instead, what happened was that water was essentially poured down the drain.
Yep.
And it was this utterly precious supply of water to support agriculture, the entire ag industry in that part of California for this season, and he had it just poured down the drain because he's a dope and because he only thinks in terms of PR stunts, essentially, instead of governing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, if somebody had given him a map of California, he could have taken a Sharpie and he could have drawn the water.
He could have drawn a new pipeline.
A long arrow down to Los Angeles, and there you go. Right.
Yeah, he could have rerouted the California aqueduct system.
Yes.
And you're right. Why didn't? Oh my gosh! I know you would never do it, but if you were working for him, he'd
Mr. President,
out, right?
grab the Sharpie. Show them where the water needs to go.
And it'll have gone there by magic. Draw your own reality.
And the real reality is that come August, there are going to be a lot of farmers who are in real trouble. Yeah.
Yeah, and they, and a lot of them were nervous already. They were kind of hoping he wouldn't. He was just, campaigning on the promise to deport everybody. But a lot of them were really, really hoping he wouldn't do that because, of course, they rely on Latino farm workers. You cannot get enough native-born Americans to pick crops. Anybody in California will tell you it's a joke to think you ever could. It's incredibly hard work. And there's a reason why there's such a long history of farm workers coming here from Mexico and the rest of Central and South America. Because there's never, unless you go back to the days of, the Dust Bowl and the Oklahoma refugees, which was the previous generation of farm workers, and they were desperate refugees. Mm-hmm. And so they did the back-breaking work that you see in the Grapes of Wrath, in the Henry Fonda movie or in Steinbeck's book. But, for generations, the Okies, as they were called, have been replaced by people from Mexico and south of Mexico. And our ag industry would not survive without them. And they're not all illegal, but a lot of them are. And if you get rid of them, even these conservative farm and ranch owners in California, they don't like that part of the Trump agenda. They were just hoping he wouldn't do it, but they'll be suffering as they lose workforce as all of these folks are rounded up by the thousands or they flee because they're afraid they're going to be rounded up.
And, those people were interviewed by the media, and they said, because it was like, well, then you'll just hire like Americans to, and the owner looked at the reporter and was like, you don't understand. Nobody will take these jobs.
No,
it isn't
won't.
like there's a ready workforce ready to step in here. There was even a dairy farmer, and he was, I don't know, North Dakota, South Dakota, one of those northern red states, and he was a dairy farmer, and he said, I rely on immigrants. My dairy farm runs 24/7. You take away the immigrants or they're too afraid to show up to work, within 24 hours, my whole farm, everything I do grinds to a halt. It was out there. And I know we don't have a lot of time, but it's just incredible to me that after we saw him in the White House the first time, and we saw that no matter how crazy a thing he says, he will try to make it happen. All these people who were like, well, I didn't think, I didn't think he'd do this. I didn't think he'd do that. I thought he would understand that I need, that my workers aren't criminals. And he never said, he said that they were going to go after everybody. I have no patience for these people, Spencer. I have no patience.
Well, and if I could, one more little just bit of on-the-scene reporting. I live near Salinas, California, the capital of the Salinas Valley, the home of John Steinbeck, by the way. And in the past, there's a lot of just really shameful exploitive treatment of Latino farm workers in the Salinas Valley. But things have gotten better over the years thanks to the organizing of lots of Latino organizers, including Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta and people like that. And now, these days, it's not like everything's wonderful, far from it, but a lot of these growers in the Salinas Valley are actually quite enlightened now, and they actually pay well. And they even, one of them, a company called Tanamura and Ansel, actually provides housing for its farm workers and it's good housing from what I've seen, and because the housing is way too expensive, and the local governments haven't been able to solve the problem of affordable housing. So you've got that, and they will tell you that if you have this fantasy that if you get rid of all the Latino farm workers or the ones who aren't here legally, and scare away half the legal ones, that you'll create jobs for Americans. They too will laugh in your face. Every now and then somebody, as an experiment, sometimes a reporter will do it. They'll try to spend a day picking strawberries or picking lettuce. And what typically happens is they can do it for a few hours and they just have to stop because it's such incredibly hard work. And the reason there are so many folks from south of our border doing this work is that the pay is better than they could get otherwise, and they know how to work that hard. And they were invited. That's the most shameful part about this. They're not there because they, beat their way into the country and demanded that all these agriculture companies hire them. They're there because they're needed, and they provide a crucially important service. And they work so hard doing it that there's very few second or third or more generation Americans who can even do this work. It's so grueling.
Yeah. Spencer, we need to take a break. I'm talking to Spencer Critchley. We are going to get to Chapter 7 of The Liberal Backbone, Spencer's new book, when we come right back after this.
Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive. Every weekday afternoon from 2 to 5 p.m. on WCPT 820.
And joining me is Spencer Critchley. You know him as the author of Patriots of Two Nations. His new book, The Liberal Backbone, is being released one chapter at a time at dastardlycleverness.com. The 7th chapter is Meet the New Boss. And I must say, I was a little thrown, Spencer, when I pulled up the website and I saw a big picture of a horse. And I was like, oh, this is great. We're going to talk about horses. I love horses. Horses are good. Explain to me what horses have to do with politics and tell the audience.
Well, sometimes I think it's good to make people wonder.
I wonder all the time, Spencer.
And then they find out if they read the piece. So if you read the piece. And one of the points I make in the piece is that This book, about half of it is arguing that liberals need to learn how to stand up for what they believe in against the anti-liberal woke left, and then the other half is about how to stand up more effectively against the anti-liberal MAGA right. And a lot of woke ideas sound enough like liberal ideas that liberals tend to think, oh, yeah, that's something I can agree with, but they don't realize the anti-liberal implications of where those ideas lead. And one of the main points I'm making in Chapter 7 is that the problem with the woke left's way of thinking, which is based on what is known as theory, long version would be something like postmodern critical theory, but it's commonly called theory, is that it promises liberation, but you must follow this particular method to achieve liberation. So you must achieve liberation by applying theory, essentially. And if you're not doing that, you're not really achieving liberation. And even if you think you yourself are free and are thinking freely, you're not, because you're a victim of all the oppressive illusions that make up Western society. And so it's this, what I call the paradox of liberation. We're going to set you free, but it must be free in the way we decide. Mm-hmm. And there's a long tradition of this way of thinking. And one of the comparisons I make is the effect is kind of like you're going to set all the horses free from a big corral and then herd them into a small one. Mm-hmm. And, there are problems. Yeah, and that is kind of what happens because, again, liberals can be attracted to this because theory does identify the ways that socially constructed illusions condition us to accept as normal stuff that really shouldn't be normal. So, living in an aggressively free market capitalist society, you can accept that it's normal that we all compete against each other, that money and status really matter. The size of your house and the neighborhood you live in really matter. And if you work hard, and spend your whole life climbing the ladder, that'll end up being a good life. And if that means that other people suffer along the way, well, that's just the cost of, achieving, your own personal vision of success. And, if you wholeheartedly, if you are genuinely thinking freely and you really are aware of all the other ways to live and you've decided that is the way you want to live, well, okay. But a lot of people just live that way because culturally it's been made to seem normal. And so theory would say, all of that, it all just exists to prop up capitalism, which is an inherently exploitive, unfair, oppressive system. And if you could just free your mind, you could see you don't have to live that way. So that sounds very attractive to liberals. And, I wholeheartedly agree that we should not just accept assumptions like that. And there are other ways to live that I think end up being far richer and more satisfying and more humane. But what happens is you then find that in applying theory, it turns out that a lot of ideas, a whole range of thought, a whole range of political debate is declared to be off limits, essentially, or illegitimate because it props up what are seen as these oppressive illusions. So now all of a sudden, anything a political conservative says to you is you have to start off with the assumption that it's essentially illegitimate because they're going to be arguing for capitalism probably, or arguing for some version of the existing system we have, and therefore they're continuing oppression by propping up all these oppressive illusions that make oppression seem normal. So now you're in this position of saying, essentially, there's nothing a conservative could say to me that I would listen to. Mm-hmm. And then you'd find out that liberalism in general, like as in liberal democracy, which includes traditional conservatives and people on the left all the way over to like Bernie Sanders and AOC, well, even the liberal left, if they believe in liberalism, which is this philosophy of freedom that came out of the Enlightenment, that's kind of illegitimate too, because liberalism is a product of this whole oppressive Western Enlightenment-based and capitalist worldview. And so liberalism itself, any argument made by any kind of traditional liberal, whether they're on the right or all the way over to the progressive left, it's essentially illegitimate because it doesn't actually radically challenge the whole system of what they see as illusions. So that's not really allowed either. So, it's allowed in that you can go ahead and say it, but it's not going to be listened to. It's essentially going to be dismissed. So this is what I mean. if you're living in a liberal democracy, it's like you're a horse in a very big corral. I would argue you're on an enormous ranch or potentially the great outdoors with some limits. Like, don't go in that forest over there because there's Nazis over there.
Really?
And you probably don't want to go in that desert because that's where the communist dictators live. But aside from that, your mind can range anywhere you want. But under theory, you end up herded into this small corral where you essentially have to adopt this ideology.
Spencer, we need to take a break. You, in Chapter 7, talk about Ibram X. Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. And I read that book, and I felt bad because when I read it, I had some problems with it, and I was worried that, because I had some problems with the way he was explaining himself and his logic, that maybe that meant I was a bad person. And I would like to, you mention How to Be an Anti-Racist and Ibram X. Kendi in this piece, and I would like to talk about that specifically when we come right back after this.
Don't turn that dial. Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive, returns right now.
A fair balance where the facts come out.
On WCPT 820.
I'm talking with Spencer Critchley, whose new book, The Liberal Backbone, is being excerpted a chapter at a time on his website, dastardlycleverness.com. In the newest chapter that's been posted, The New Boss, he talks about these ideas of can you move forward, but do you have to only move forward in one way with one kind of thinking? I read Ibram X. Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist, and while I certainly read it because I did want to be an anti-racist, and I was looking for, suggestions he had or behaviors of mine that I could correct, but I was made a little bit uncomfortable by the book because of the way it was so, if you want to be an anti-racist, you have to do X, otherwise you're a racist. It kind of echoed that whole idea of letting the horses out of the big corral only to put them in the small corral. And I thought maybe it was a failing of mine that somehow I just didn't get the book the way I was supposed to, Spencer, but you write about it very cogently. Explain to the audience why you cited that as an example and what you were trying to convey.
Yeah, and I think your description of your reaction is perfect. I think lots of people have that reaction, especially white people who are especially, well-meaning white people, especially anxious if they're reading something that's about anti-racism and they're feeling like, I'm not sure I agree with this, and they think, oh, my God.
Yeah.
But I am an anti-racist, but maybe I only think I am, And shall I read just a short bit? Because it might be faster than me trying to summarize it. So I say many liberals accepted Ibram X. Kendi as an authoritative voice on anti-racism, especially after he published his best-selling guide, How to Be an Anti-Racist. In that book, it turns out there's only one way to be an anti-racist, Kendi's way, which is the way framed by theory. Kendi writes that there are only three ways to think about race: assimilationist, segregationist, or anti-racist, meaning anti-racist as defined by Kendi and theory. The first two ways of thinking are racist. That leaves the only way to be anti-racist. Is it the only way, though? Kendi's anti-racism is founded on a rejection of what he refers to as the so-called Enlightenment. He asserts it was inherently racist, and he says so is all Enlightenment-based thought. In a 2023 article about the ideas in How to Be an Anti-Racist, he writes, I knew about the equation of the Enlightenment and, quote, reason, and, quote, objectivity, and, quote, empiricism, with whiteness and Western Europe and masculinity and the bourgeoisie. And that, as I say, that equation is at the heart of theory as well. So a lot of readers, I think, in my experience anyway, they'll come across the ideas about the Enlightenment that you find in Kendi or other works written by people influenced by theory, and it'll be the first time you've ever encountered a lot of those ideas. Like the idea that there might have been racism embedded in Enlightenment thought will be new to a lot of people, or that white identity was invented essentially to justify slavery, which, there's a lot of historical documentation that supports that latter point, by the way. And so they'll start to think, well, gee whiz, I didn't know about this. But then they'll be thinking, but I have to get rid of, does this mean I can't believe in objective truth anymore, or empiricism, or reason, or liberalism, it turns out? and then they're thinking, well, I'm not sure I'm comfortable with that, but I don't feel like I know enough to argue with the idea. Mm-hmm. And I'm telling you, I had similar reactions when I first ran into some of this stuff. I knew a little bit more about the Enlightenment, I think, because I'd been studying it for a while. But I was thinking, is this just something I haven't thought of before? But I would say, if you're a liberal and you know why you're a liberal and you learn more about this, you'll find out that a lot of what he's claiming requires distorting the historical record. So he's right. There was a ton of racism in the Enlightenment, during the Enlightenment, like there was everywhere. And Enlightenment reason and pseudoscience was used to justify slavery and racial hierarchies. That's true. And I say true because it's documented very well. It's been studied by and reported on by lots of very credible historians who aren't necessarily theorists. They're just historians. But it's a distortion of the record to claim that Enlightenment reason is just inherently racist and inherently exploitive. And I won't get into all the details of this, but I'll assure people if you do, you'll find that it's far from an open and shut case. And it's easy to make the case that Enlightenment reason has been used to fight racism all the way along, including from the beginning, and that the liberalism it created has had more success pushing back on racism than any other ideology, for all its shortcomings. But a lot of liberals won't. They'll be sort of feeling a bit at sea and feeling like maybe I just need to learn more. And
well, yeah, that's kind of. I was like, it's obviously my fault that I'm not grasping exactly what he's trying to tell me. It's my shortcoming, whether my intellectual shortcoming in not being able to follow his train of thought to the end. Yeah. And I felt very sad when I put the book down, like somehow I had failed.
Yeah, well, and this is typical of the way theory works. If you're not on board with it, it's because you don't understand it yet.
Mm. Yeah.
And I've spent a lot of time studying it in the last few years because when I wrote my first book, Patriots of Two Nations, it was just kind of emerging from the academic fringe. And I sort of touched on it in that book, but I didn't think it needed too much space. And I was wrong about that. And it's typical that people will raise questions like, wait a minute, is liberalism bad? Is tolerance for a wide range of opinions bad? And, theorists will argue, yeah, it can be, because you're allowing, the legitimization of ideas that are inherently oppressive. And they won't feel equipped to argue with it, but I can tell you when you do look into it, you can come out the other side and you may learn some stuff. It's good to be challenged. And it's not like no theorist has ever come up with any good ideas. But you can come out the other side and still believe in liberalism. And I'm hoping to help with that with this book, to help people present sympathetic arguments for the theory version of stuff, what amounts to the woke left view of the world, but then present the sympathetic arguments for liberalism and show how you can still be a liberal. And if you're going to be a liberal, it might help you to understand what you're defending it against. And Ibram X. Kendi, in particular, became quite a celebrity, and a lot of people just accepted his ideas and ideas of similar thinkers uncritically. And when you do subject them to some critical thought, they fall apart. I mean, his thinking is not only anti-liberal, so if you do believe in liberalism, you'll find you can't agree with some of these assertions. But it's incoherent. So and self-contradictory. And I'm not the only one who has come to that conclusion. There are lots of other liberal thinkers, liberals on the left, who, don't consider Ibram X. Kendi to be much of a scholar of the Enlightenment or much of a political theorist, in large part because his thinking is incoherent, or when you actually are familiar with the history that he's citing, you discover how much he's distorted it in order to serve he's either deliberately distorted it or he's just not very well educated about the history of the Enlightenment. So it's easy to cherry pick the history of the Enlightenment and come up with examples of people like Thomas Jefferson and other people who were enthusiastic Enlightenment thinkers who were also slave owners or racists, and said racist stuff. But, racism was standard back then. And there were also leading Enlightenment figures like Denis Diderot, for example, who was the main editor of the French Encyclopedia, which is one of the major documents of the Enlightenment, who could be giving seminars on anti-racism today and anti-colonialism today. And this was back in the late 1700s. And, Benjamin Franklin, who started out like most white people, was a racist for much of his life, and later in life realized he had been wrong. And he wrote about how wrong he was. And the abolitionists, the anti-slavery activists who were working with Enlightenment ideas. So, as I say, Kendi cherry picks the history of the Enlightenment. And when you really analyze his arguments, they're not only anti-liberal, like with all these declarations of the one way you can see things. You can either see it this way and be wrong, or this way and be right, and those are your choices. And they're incoherent. So people should, if they feel uncomfortable reading Kendi, they shouldn't feel bad about themselves. Now, I hope it's obvious, wholeheartedly agree that anti-racism is good and important, and it's not enough just to just say, well, I'm not a racist. He's arguing it's important to work against racism, and I totally agree with that. And I agree with him that there a lot of people still don't fully appreciate just how awful the history of racism is and how pervasive it remains. It doesn't mean it's as pervasive as he thinks it is, I would say, but it's definitely still a very serious problem. So I agree with all that. But the short version of all this is if you read Kendi because you want to be an anti-racist and support anti-racism and yet find yourself feeling uncomfortable, don't assume that it's your fault.
And I agree with the overarching effort behind the book, which is to make us more self-aware and to have us think about, the larger implications of the way we live our lives and the way we think. And I guess that sort of thing is going to become even more important, because I swear that the hats, those red hats, should just say, make America white again. I mean, there seems to be, I think, a big part of the people who voted for Trump were just tired of all these black and brown people. Darn it, I didn't get that raise. I didn't get that promotion. Must be because of DEI. I was clearly the most qualified candidate. I think that we need to think about how to be anti-racist, how to be very more equitable going forward. But I agree with you. I think there's more than one way of thinking. I think there's more than one path forward.
Yeah, and this I think is so crucially important because, and I'm going to be writing about this in Chapter 8, which is coming up.
A preview
for all of these positions, like anti-racism, DEI, gender equality, you can go down the list. There's a liberal version of that policy, and it can be a very progressive position. But what's in effect happened is that the theory crowd, have, ironically, because they're anti-colonialists, but ironically they've colonized each of these issues, and in effect claim them, and are making the argument there's only one way to approach this, which is our way. And that way is explicitly anti-liberal. They think liberalism is part of this whole oppressive Western worldview. And I'm going to be laying out the liberal positions on these things, which, as a liberal, I think are not only better in terms of allowing for more freedom, and freedom of thought in particular, but work better. So DEI has become this huge vulnerability for the Democratic Party, for example, and Democrats kind of haplessly don't know how to respond to these attacks because I don't think they know what they actually stand for. And if you're a liberal, and the Democratic Party is a liberal, party, you don't stand for some of these DEI policies that have become popular, because they actually are founded on theory, and they actually are, they do divide people by their identities, and they do go against liberal values. But you do stand for DEI, but it's liberal DEI, right? And there are liberal approaches to all of this. And yes, we absolutely need to make, starting with white people, more aware that of the different realities that different kinds of people live in, and you can't just live in a world where being white and seeing things like a white person is normal and everybody else is strange or just wrong. But that doesn't mean there's only one way to approach that. Like, there's the theory-based sort of woke version of DEI, which turns off many liberals on the left. If you've actually ever been in one of these classes, you find yourself going, well, wait a minute, I don't actually agree with that. And then what you're saying, well, does that mean I'm a bad person? Does that mean I'm a racist? No, there's a liberal way of thinking about all of these issues that still preserves freedom of thought and people's individuality and doesn't require you to sign up for this ideology you might not actually agree with, and achieves the same goals, which are to make sure that everybody's included, everybody's heard, everybody isn't forced to think the same way. And, so that's kind of a preview of what's coming in the next chapter.
Spencer Critchley is going to be joining me on a regular basis. We've decided to just schedule it for the third Wednesday of every month, which means you have until March 19th, you, Spencer, to get the next chapter up, and those of us listening and talking to get it read by then. Spencer, thank you as always. It's always a pleasure.